Hello, my name is Ben Moulton. I'm a master's student here at USU, working with Dr. Hunsaker in the USU Aero Lab. This is my presentation on my thesis work. It's titled 3D Printed Morphing Wings for Controlling Yaw on Flying Wing Aircraft. And so just a little bit of a roadmap for what I'm going to talk about. First, I want to talk why we care about yaw control on a flying wing aircraft. And then I want to talk about why we chose 3D printing as the manufacturing method for this morphing mechanism. And then I want to talk about why we chose to design our morphing wings based on parabolic flaps. And in case there's words that don't seem too familiar to you, I'll address those a little bit later on. Then I'm going to talk about some of the criteria that we established for this mechanism that we were developing. And then I'm going to talk about some of the potential designs for these morphing airfoils and morphing wings that we came up with. I'll talk about some of the testing procedures that we put these designs through and some of the lessons we learned throughout that process. And then I'll be presenting the final design and showing some results for the final analysis of that design. First, I want to focus on there are three principal axes of motion on an aircraft. The one I want to focus on is yaw. So a flying wing aircraft does not have this vertical or horizontal surface that you see back here. That's the tail of the aircraft. And the purpose of that is to make the aircraft more efficient, to get rid of those surfaces which cause an increase in total drag on the aircraft. And so we can get rid of those surfaces, but in an oversimplified statement, but we generally use this rudder, this vertical surface here, to control yaw on the aircraft. How do we control yaw on an aircraft if we don't have that vertical surface? And so we do that. One potential solution is to have multiple control surfaces along the wing, each of which are actuated differently in order to produce a yawing moment on the aircraft. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on that later. And so now that we understand why we need to control yaw on a flying wing aircraft, I want to talk a little bit about fused deposition modeling and why we chose that for our manufacturing method. FDM, also known as, more commonly known as 3D printing, has several benefits. The first, it's repeatable, meaning you can create a part in a CAD program, and then you can take that part and put it in a slicer. A slicer is a software package that's used to discretize a CAD model so that a 3D printer can print it in layers. You can take that part, stick it in the slicer, and discretize this file and create this 3D CAD model, this 3D printable model. And then you give it to your printer and your printer prints it out. And so you can take those same files and give them back to your printer and print out the same part again. It's repeatable. FDM is also replicable, meaning that I could take those parts files, the printer settings, the printer specs, give them to someone else, and they would be able to get a 3D printer and create the exact same part. A third benefit to FDM is that it is very quick at manufacturing. You can literally be creating something 24/7, and it's very useful for rapid prototyping, meaning you can be creating a design change, print it out, create the next design change while you're figuring out the problems with the previous design change. A fourth benefit is that the materials for FDM are relatively cheap. PLA, for example, which we'll talk about quite a bit, polylactic acid, is a very common 3D printing filament and runs about $20 to $30 a kilogram. The materials are also relatively durable depending on their application. For our case of flying RC aircraft, PLA works just fine. And so now that we understand a little bit about why we need to control yaw on an aircraft and why we would choose to 3D print this morphing mechanism, I want to talk about a design that is very influential on this morphing mechanism. It's called a parabolic flap. And so shown here are two different types of flaps. What you would probably more commonly think of as a flap is shown here as an articulated flap. It has a single hinge point about which the remainder of the wing, the flap, is rotated. So you can see this dashed dot line, that's the surface of the airfoil, and that dashed dot line right there is the camber line. So that camber line it's a little bit of an oversimplified statement, but that camber line is the center line of the airfoil. Now that camber line is straight rotated about the hinge point. And something important about that the fact that it's just a straight rotation about the hinge point is the camber line slope for this traditional flap, this articulated flap, is disconnected at the hinge point. And that causes a pressure spike and actually disturbs the flow, causes the flow to separate. The parabolic flap, shown here in the solid line, is a slightly different type of flap. It also hinges at the same hinge point, but the camber line conforms to a parabolic shape. And that parabolic shape causes the airflow to be more efficient, or it more efficiently controls the airflow. And that efficiency comes from the fact that the camber line slope, that's shown here in this dotted line, is first order continuous. And so it does not have that discontinuity that is present in the articulated flap. A second benefit of the parabolic flap is shown here on the right. It's the ideal flap effectiveness. The ideal flap effectiveness is a measure of the effect of 1 degree rotation of the flap compared to a 1 degree rotation in angle of attack. And so, as you can imagine, with a traditional articulated flap, as you as you increase the flap chord fraction up to 1, meaning your flap takes up the whole wing, as you increase that flap chord, it approaches 1, meaning as you increase this flap size, it slowly just becomes a straight rotation and angle of attack. The parabolic flap is more effective for every flap chord fraction. Once again, because, and you can see it right here, for example, with a 0.4 flap chord fraction, whereas the articulated flap can never get above a value of unity for an ideal flap effectiveness, the parabolic flap reaches that at about 0.4 flap chord fraction. And so because of this continuity in the camber line slope, and because of the increased flap effectiveness, we designed our morphing mechanism to be a parabolic flap. And so with that background information, I want to talk a little bit about the morphing criteria that we designed, that we developed for our morphing mechanism. The first was that in order to be able to control yaw through some analyses, we found that we would have to be able to deflect each section plus or minus 20 degrees. And that, once again, that's to be able to control yaw. A second criteria was that it had to reach a fatigue limit for at least a single flight of 600 cycles, preferably multiple flights, 3 or 4 or even 5. We also found, we also determined that this morphing mechanism had to be able to take the structure loading expected on general aviation aircraft. And so what general aviation aircraft do, this is once again a little bit of a simplified statement, but they determine the full weight of the aircraft, and then they determine how that lift distribution would be discretized along the wing. And so they'll load up the aircraft with this weight split up in all these little sandbags, and they'll make sure that this wing is able to take this loading. And so, for example, to ensure that they're able to take all these maneuvers, they require that it takes so many Gs or so many weights of the aircraft distributed along the wing. So general aviation aircraft generally have a requirement 3 to 6 Gs somewhere in there. Fighter aircraft are more than that. So we decided that a good load limit for our aircraft would be 4 Gs. And then the fourth criteria that we came up with was that the difference, the average difference of the parabolicity of our 3D printed flap compared to this flap shape determined from analytical equations published by Hunsaker et al. The difference had to be less than or equal to 10% chord, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The first design that I present today is the Airfoil Recambering Compliance System, or ARCS design. This design is 3D printed from you can see 3 different colors on that figure. It's 3D printed from 2 different materials. Outlined in black is what would be 3D printed in PLA. PLA is a stiffer material, polylactic acid, and it's very similar to what Legos are made out of. Legos are made out of ABS, but they're very similar materials. Outlined in green here is what would be 3D printed in TPU. TPU, thermoplastic polyurethane, is a stretchier material, more like what would what the silicon cover part of your phone case is made out of. So something stretchy, elastic, flexible. And outlined in blue is what would be 3D printed span-wise in PLA and TPU. Now, for those who are unfamiliar, span, for example, we're looking at this airfoil, span-wise direction would be into and out of the screen. And so it's layered into and out of the screen with this PLA and TPU. And there will be a couple figures later on that'll make more sense with that. This design is actuated by placing a servo motor inside the leading edge, and a servo arm extends down below the servo motor in line with the flow. And that servo arm is connected to this tongue in the slip joint via a control rod. As the servo arm rotates, you can imagine it pushes and pulls on that tongue, which causes the airfoil to deflect up and down. One of the benefits to this design is that it is able to conform the camber line to a parabolic shape. That is the purpose of these arc connections between the upper and lower surface. They constrain the upper and lower surfaces so that it deflects in a parabolic fashion. A second benefit is that the design is extremely simple, meaning you could take a code with a few lines of code, you give it an airfoil, it creates this geometry, you give it to a CAD program, you pull it, and you create a 3D wing. The design is also extremely lightweight. While PLA and TPU aren't necessarily lightweight materials, because there's so little infill in the leading edge and there's all this negative space in the trailing edge, we are able to create this wing that has a comparable weight to general RC foam aircraft. And a fourth benefit to this design is that it is internally actuated, meaning that the servo motor placed inside this leading edge does not obstruct the flow while it is actuating back and forth. You can completely enclose the servo beneath the skin. And so, as I mentioned before, this design is printed out of two materials, which will be important later on. The second design that I want to talk about today is the Kinetic Internal Nexus Compliance System, or KINX design. Once again, that's a mouthful, so I'll just call it the KINX design. This design shown here, outlined in black, is what would be 3D printed out of PLA. You'll notice it's 3D printed out of only one material. And so it's actuated similar to the ARC's design, a servo motor inside the leading edge. The servo arm extends down, it connects to this tongue via control rod, pushes and pulls, and deflects this wing up and down. And so the first benefit to this design that I want to talk about is that it is able to conform the camber line to a parabolic shape. That is the purpose of these spring-like shapes here in the trailing edge. Those constrain the upper and lower surfaces, and so that when the wing deflects, it conforms that camber line to a parabolic shape. The design is also extremely simple. Once again, with a simple piece of code that you could input the airfoil to, you would be able to create this geometry, spit it out in a CAD program, and pull it and create a 3D wing. Third benefit is that the design is lightweight. Once again, PLA is a heavier material, but because we're able to decrease the infill to almost negligible infill in the inner surface, we're able to 3D print this design with similar weight to traditional foam RC aircraft. A fourth benefit to this design is that it is internally actuated, meaning that the servo is placed inside the leading edge and does not obstruct the flow. It does not extend into the flow at all. You're able to put a piece of tape over the hole and you don't have to worry about that. A final benefit that is makes it preferable to the ARC's design is that this design is 3D printed out of a single material. 3D printers that can 3D print with more than one material are generally more expensive, more complex. The prints take more time. And so it's very beneficial to be able to 3D print something out of a single material, to have a design that is only 3D printed out of a single material. And so with these two designs in mind, I want to talk about the two types of flaps that we designed our morphing airfoils, for which we designed our morphing airfoils. On the left is the continuous control surface. And so what that means is that the trailing edge is continuous along the span of the wing. So for example, as this actuator rib extends down and that actuator rib extends up, you can imagine that this requires quite a bit of stretching at the trailing edge, and we'll get into that a little bit later. On the right is a second design of a flap. It's called the discrete control surface, or discrete control surfaces. And so you can see these distinct disconnections of the trailing edge. And those will be very important here in a minute. So you'll notice they are slightly different. And so a colleague in the USU Aerolab looked at the yaw control comparison between the discrete control flaps and the continuous control flaps, or excuse me, discrete control surfaces and continuous control surfaces. And through this study, he found that the discrete control surfaces are more able to control yaw. They have greater yaw authority than the continuous control surface. And now why is that? That's because of these distinct changes at the trailing edge. These distinct switches between sections cause greater gradients in the lift distribution than the continuous control surface. Those greater gradients in the lift distribution cause greater forces of greater amounts of induced drag. And now, so you can imagine if one has a greater force for the same moment arm, the discrete control surfaces is able to create more yawing, a greater yawing moment. And once again, that's because of those gradients in the lift distribution. And so because of that, as you can imagine, we designed the ARCS design with the continuous control surface in mind, and we designed the kinks mechanism with the discrete control surfaces in mind. And so because of the benefits of printing out of a single material with the kinks design and the increased yaw control of the discrete control surfaces, we proceeded, our final design was use the discrete control surfaces with the kinks design. And I'll be addressing that later on. So through this process, we put these designs through 4 different tests. And these tests were to make sure that we would be able to meet the criteria that I mentioned earlier. And so, for example, right here, this is an airfoil test. First, I would create this model, and then I would deflect it to make sure we were able to provide the deflection required for the yaw control. And then I would print out a 2D drawing of the parabolic deflection that would be obtained from analytical equations published by Hunsaker et al. And compare visually. So for example, you want that upper surface to match perfectly, but it does not. You can see a little gap, and you can see a little gap here on the lower surface. And so I would visually compare the parabolicity of the mechanism to what we would expect or what we would desire it to have. If it successfully passed the airfoil test, we'd move on to the wing test, where this is where we would test things like geometry effects like sweep, taper, dihedral. We were also looking at how, for the ARCS design, how 2 opposing actuators would interact. So for example, a problem we encountered here was some buckling. You can see some buckling on that surface. And so that was a problem that had to be mitigated that we ended up figuring out later on. And something I'll mention is that it wasn't a one and done. We went through a lot of iterations to make sure it would pass each test and then continue on to the next level of testing. Upon successful completion of wing testing, we went on to static testing. And so with static testing, we were looking at trying to figure out how we would put a mechanized servo motor in there, how we would place it, how we would orient it, how we would attach it to the body, how we would connect it to the control surface. We were also looking to make sure, could we still achieve the deflection amounts we were expecting back in our airfoil test? Could we still provide that same deflection? So for example, something in this test, you can see that control rod bowing. That was a problem. That was something that we had to figure out. That was a problem that we found during this test. So upon completion of the static testing, we moved on to dynamic testing. And so with dynamic testing, the purpose was to, I would take this 3D printed prototype, stick it out into, hold it out a car window, as you can see in the little video there, and I would let the wing deflect up and down. And the purpose of this was to make sure, could the servos actually push and pull enough to provide the deflection that we would need? Or would the servos warm up? For example, later on in this test, this servo got so hot because it was fighting these other 2 servos. It got so hot it warmed the hot glue that was holding it in there and ended up popping out. And so a second target of this test was to figure out, could the structure support dynamic loading? And that was simply to make sure we didn't have flutter at the trailing edge. which we had a lot earlier on in our non-3D printed prototypes. And so the purpose of all this testing was to make sure that it would pass those requirements that we'd specified earlier. So there were some lessons that we learned along the way. I wish I could go into detail about all of them, but I can't. But there are a couple that I wanted to focus on. The first that I wanted to talk about has to do with the ARCs design. So shown here on the bottom, you can see some of the iterations that we went through up to the kinks ARCs design. We hadn't developed the kinks design yet. Shown on the right is one of these ARCs prototypes being printed. And so you can see in white the PLA and in black the TPU. And this is our dual extruder printer. The white PLA prints about 30 to 60 degrees C cooler than the TPU, that flexible material. And so we learned that as we minimize the difference, the print temperature difference between the PLA and the TPU, we were able to improve the layered adhesion between the PLA and TPU. These little, for example, these PLA fingers you see there in the PLA control ribs. A second lesson that we learned along the way was that it was preferable to use lighter colors. And that's simply because one of the characteristics of 3D printing filaments is what's called a glass transition temperature. The glass transition temperature is a point at which the material becomes glassy. It becomes a little bit squishy, a little bit melty. And as you can imagine, it has to get quite above that in order to melt it enough that it's liquid so it can 3D print. However, the glass transition temperature was a little bit of a concern. I took a couple prototypes outside, set them in the hot sun, some darker ones and some lighter ones, and the darker ones retain more heat because of their color than the white ones. And because of that retention of heat, the darker ones were actually able to overpass the glass transition temperature, and I could poke holes in the material. And so, you know, that's a big concern. You don't want your aircraft to just kind of melt while it's flying. And so we started printing with lighter colored materials, mostly with white colored filaments. A third lesson that we learned along the way, which I'll talk about here, it wasn't, I'll add a caveat at the beginning, it wasn't the optimum value. So we learned that it was worked decently well to have a skin thickness of 0.8 millimeters. And so you can see here in the trailing edge, it's pretty thin. And in the leading edge right there, you can see how thin that is. 0.8 millimeters was about decent enough to be able to deflect this compliant mechanism. And it was also enough to provide structure on the leading edge to support it during printing, as well as to support dynamic loading during flight. And once again, that wasn't an optimum value. That was simply a value that worked for us. This whole project, I should say, has almost a theme of move fast, break stuff. It wasn't to determine the best morphing mechanism. It was to determine, it was to design one that worked. And so I will say that skin thickness is printer and design dependent. A few more lessons that we learned through the prototyping process were that, first of all, we could indeed 3D print a morphing wing. We could also 3D print with flexible materials. That was an amazing print. I remember the day that we printed that. So shown here, you can see the first print of the ARCs design. One of the lessons we learned with the TPU was that we had to have some sort of support structure, because we were printing basically this wall out of this flexible material, and it would buckle while it was printing, and it would end up in failed prints. And so we learned that we had to have some sort of support structure. In the beginning, they were these semicircles on the upper and lower surfaces, and later turned into these arcs that ended up also helping the parabolicity. Along the way, we also learned that there was a good ratio of PLA to TPU. And for these purposes, this is a 5-inch section of TPU, and interspersed are 5 1/8 inch span-wise thick ribs of PLA. And that was in order to prevent the surface from buckling. And we found that was a good ratio for that. Over here, you can see the first kinks design. And over here, you can see some of the later on designs as we shifted the kink backwards. You can see we removed that second kink in this design, and then we shifted it backwards for the final design of the kinks morphing airfoil. And so here are a couple pictures of the parabolic deflections on the ARCs prototype and the kinks prototype. plus or minus 15 degrees. And shown here is the arcs design in a continuous control surface. So you can see that stretching that I was talking about earlier at the trailing edge and this differential gradient. We were able to get about 2.5 degrees per inch. And so as you can imagine, if you increase this morphing section width, you'd be able to get a little bit more deflection difference between actuators. Shown on the right, is the discrete control surfaces with the kinks mechanism. And so you can see the distinct changes between surfaces. And so as I mentioned, we chose for the final design the kinks mechanism with the discrete control surfaces. And those are shown here. This is the final kinks design with the optimal placement of a servo to be able to control this mechanism. Like I said, we ended up designing with a kink that was shifted aft a little bit, and it was only one kink. We'd remove the second kink. And that was because of the parabolicity. We were trying to get the parabolicity as close as possible to that determined by analytic equations. Shown here is the I-beam that we developed for the structural support, which we'll get into a little bit later. But you can see this white space that is 100% infill 3D printed with material with these 3 holes in the I-beam. And so on the bottom here is shown the Horizon aircraft, the airframe used to demonstrate yaw control. And this aircraft uses these mechanisms, uses these kinks mechanisms. You can just see the discrete control surfaces, and we'll talk a little bit about these slits that you can see later on. But these discrete control surfaces are cosine clustered. And so what that means is you can imagine a circle that starts at one wingtip, goes over to the other wingtip, a semicircle. If you had a degree value from the center and you equally spaced it along the length of the outer perimeter of that semicircle, and then you drew a line down from where that line touched the circle, you would get these, the lines for the splitting of these discrete control surfaces. And the purpose of cosine clustering these control surfaces is to improve the yaw control of the aircraft. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the analysis results that we got with the kinks design with the discrete control surfaces. It's pictured here on the left, deflected to different locations during a static test. And on the right are the deflection values that we were able to get from this mechanism determined based on section. And you'll notice that we were able to get plus and minus 20 degrees for each section. And if you look back here, that's the purpose. There were multiple tests for each section. And each of those sections, we ended up having to remove a little bit of material from the tip of each trailing, of each morphing, of the morphing part of each discrete section. And that was simply to prevent the control surfaces from binding. We also had to make sure that the servos had enough power, that they were big enough servos that they could provide enough torque. And we were also providing those servos enough power that they could deflect, because it was a compliant mechanism. It was tough for the servo to push back and forth. A second analysis we performed was to fatigue test this section. We ended up completing over 15,000 cycles on 2 different sections, and we determined that was more than enough. That was probably a little bit less than 3 flights for a 10-minute, three 10-minute flights. And so we determined that was well enough. We actually ended up burning out a servo on this test here at the 24,000 mark. And we determined, you know what, that was good enough. A third test was to make sure that structural I-beam, which we were creating as a 3D printed spar inside the aircraft, would be able to take the loading that we would expect, as I mentioned, with that 4G's value. So we loaded it to failure. It ended up breaking at 153 pounds, which ended up being 4.88 Gs for that test. And so it passed that. We knew that we would be able to support structurally the loading that we would expect to encounter during a flight test. And the final test, which I mentioned previously, was to look at the parabolicity of this shape. In other words, comparing the outer mold line of shown here in orange of this 3D print to that of the outer mold line determined from those analytic equations. And so we digitized this shape from a picture and we compared it. So these are the average differences of the average differences of this outer mold line. And that was the measure of the parabolicity difference. And so we were able to determine that we were able to keep below that 10% chord value. And shown here are the 3 sigma values for those differences. Here's a picture of the 3D printed complete aircraft. You can see the discrete control surfaces on that guy. And so as I mentioned before, the ARC's design with the continuous flaps is able to deflect 2.5 degrees per inch. That's the difference gradient. And the Keek's design with the discrete flaps is able to deflect plus and minus 20 degrees. And so here's a short clip of one of the glide tests of a glide test we performed a couple weeks ago to make sure that this airframe was designed correctly, designed by a couple other colleagues. And so in conclusion, the total deflection that we were able to obtain was plus and minus 20 degrees, which met that requirement. We were able to reach a limit of 15,000 cycles for the fatigue limit. Like I mentioned, that's about a 30-minute flight or 3 10-minute flights, a little bit less than. We were able to structurally support 4.88 Gs at failure, and which met our requirement of being able to take 4 Gs. And we were also to keep at that parabolicity difference of less than or equal to 10% chord. And so because of this, I present the Kinks design with the discrete control surfaces as a viable morphing mechanism that can be used to control yaw on flying wing aircraft. This work has been published in, it was presented at the AIAA SciTech Virtual Forum this year, and there's the link to that paper. And this work has been funded by the Office of Naval Research. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.